Hello and welcome to another lecture online for the History of Journalism course at Temple University. I'm Professor Harper, and today I'd like to go over some general information about media models and the periods of the U.S. press. So in starting out, the authoritarian press, which still exists in some communist countries, North Korea, Cuba, etc., it began in England under the monarchy in the 1500s, and only a short time after the invention of movable type. And what the authoritarian press did was essentially to censor news. It was to support government policies, and the press was generally controlled by the individual in power, whether that was the Tsar in Russia or the king in or queen in Britain, and later on in communist countries like the Soviet Union, and today, as I said, in North Korea, Cuba, and China. We then have the libertarian press, which began in England again in the late 1600s, and it gained a foothold in the United States shortly thereafter. And it was essentially aimed at informing and entertaining, but its chief goal was to discover the truth and serve as a check on governmental power. So we have the beginnings of a free press, if you will. The totalitarian model, which is akin to the authoritarian model, is essentially based on the writings of Karl Marx and was used in the Soviet Union and other communist countries. And here the press is owned and operated by the government, and it's aimed at furthering and expanding the influence of the communist ideology. In the early 20th century, William Hawking and others argued that the press should be at the forefront of social change, and so the socially responsible press maintains that a newspaper must, and now broadcast outlets and other media, must offer a variety of viewpoints that promotes a discussion of topics facing communities. And to a certain extent, we still have this system in place today in the United States. In terms of the periods of the press in the United States, and we'll go in to a certain extent in greater detail here, the partisan, at a later time, the partisan press essentially was the revolutionary press. And it was one that didn't let facts stand in the way of a good story. Some of the stories were fake news. In fact, Samuel Adams, one of the leaders of the revolution, used to make up stories for his newspaper and about the British and printed them. The penny press started in 1833, and this was a period where newspapers actually cost a penny. Before this time, it was, a rather expensive item to pay 5 to 10 cents for a newspaper, which was essentially the equivalent of a bottle of whiskey. So what the penny press did was it lowered the costs and therefore made newspapers much more accessible to the common folk. In the late 19th century, we have what's called yellow journalism, and it was named after a cartoon character called the Yellow Kid. The two main people involved were William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, two of the leading lights of New York journalism. It was sensational, it was readable, and it produced both great reporting and dreadful reporting. Jazz journalism in the 1920s essentially was the development of the tabloid newspapers like the New York Daily News. It made it much more portable, but it also had a jazzier feel, typographically a lot more photos. And we also have today called the professional press, and started basically in the 1950s. And the notion here is that before that time, reporters were not exactly the leading lights of society, with press in their hats, and they spent a lot of time drinking at bars. I guess some still do. But the idea was to raise journalism into a profession. Okay? There was a reaction against that in the 1960s with the alternative press. Think Rolling Stone in its early days, where it dealt with counterculture, rock music, that type of thing. And Mother Jones. Both of these publications continue to exist today, but for the most part they're closer tied in with mainstream media, or legacy media as it's known in academic circles. And now we have kind of two different elements running through here. Corporate media, the concentration of ownership into a few hands, Gannett Corporation, Fox, CBS, NBC, ABC are, generally these big operations. I used to work for ABC, which was part of Disney. I used to work for Newsweek magazine, which was part of the Washington Post Corporation. And on the other side, we have a development in the past 15 or 20 years of citizen journalism, where citizens are putting up their own blogs. They are developing alternative sources of information. They also gather news that they put up to augment, if you will, corporate media, and also to provide information to corporate media. So here's an example of the penny press. The New York Sun was the first to develop a newspaper for a penny. It's pretty boring, but there's a lot of information there. Yellow journalism, here's an example of the New York Journal, which was run by Joseph Pulitzer, and we'll talk a little bit more about yellow journalism later. And this was at the beginning of the Spanish-American War in 1898. Here's another example from the world where Admiral Dewey basically went in and defeated the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. And so you see the sensationalist nature of the headlines and the devotion to essentially one story, if you will. Jazz journalism. This is a photograph from the New York Daily News in the 1920s. The photographer snuck in a camera which was hidden around his ankle, and it was a photograph of the first woman who had been sentenced and executed. This is the moment of the execution. The alternative press, as I mentioned, Rolling Stone in the 1960s, a photograph of Bob Dylan, now Nobel laureate Bob Dylan, and the alternative press essentially said, we don't care about objectivity, fairness, and balance. We're going to come at things with an alternative view of how journalism should be done. Many famous reporters came from Rolling Stone, one of whom we will talk about later, Hunter Thompson of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. So that's what we have for today, and we'll see you online. Thanks very much.